Some moments change everything before anyone even understands what they are looking at. At exactly 7:14 p.m., inside a quiet gas station on the edge of a suburban highway in Georgia, Naomi Carter stood near the self-service counter holding a small bottle of water and a receipt she had just printed. She was dressed simply, a dark blazer over a plain shirt, her hair neatly pulled back, her posture calm, controlled, and unbothered by the noise of passing customers. Nothing about her suggested conflict, nothing about her suggested urgency, yet within seconds, that normal evening atmosphere would fracture into something far more serious. Officer Daniel Brooks entered the scene after a routine call reporting a suspicious individual lingering too long near the pumps, a description vague enough to create assumptions before facts. His first glance at Naomi was not neutral, it was evaluative, shaped by certainty rather than curiosity. Without asking basic clarifying questions, he approached with a rigid tone, instructing her to step away from the counter. Naomi complied slowly, not out of fear but out of restraint, placing her items down with deliberate calm. Around them, the gas station continued functioning, unaware that a small misunderstanding was beginning to escalate into an institutional chain reaction. Brooks requested identification, scanning her with increasing suspicion as if silence itself confirmed guilt. Naomi reached into her bag and produced her identification card without hesitation, yet the interaction did not de-escalate. Instead, another officer arrived, reinforcing the assumption that something here was not right. No one checked beyond surface-level data. No one paused long enough to consider context. The situation tightened not because of evidence, but because of interpretation. Naomi remained still, her expression steady, her voice measured when she asked for verification of procedure. That request, simple and lawful, was treated as resistance. Brooks called it non-compliance, escalating his tone as if authority required amplification to be valid. Within minutes, a perimeter formed around her presence, not because of confirmed wrongdoing, but because of procedural momentum that no one stopped to question. Inside that growing tension, Naomi made a single phone call, brief and precise, stating only her name and location. There was no panic in her voice, no emotional distortion, only clarity. What none of the officers realized was that the system she had just contacted did not operate like a civilian hotline. It was part of a classified verification network designed for high-level federal and military association checks. At first, nothing changed visibly. The gas station lights continued to flicker softly above the pumps, customers still moved in and out, and Officer Brooks remained focused on maintaining control of what he believed was a standard arrest situation. But beneath that surface, something had already begun to shift. Naomi Carter was not reacting to the situation the way most people would. She was observing it, as if measuring how far misunderstanding could travel before truth arrived. And within that silence, the first signal of institutional attention had already been triggered. The silence that followed the first call was not empty, it was waiting. Inside the gas station, Naomi Carter remained exactly where she had been instructed to stand, but the meaning of that space around her had already changed. Officer Daniel Brooks maintained his position near the counter, his posture rigid, his attention fixed on procedure rather than reflection. To him, the situation still appeared controlled, contained within the boundaries of a routine response. Yet subtle shifts were already unfolding beyond what he could perceive. The second officer, a younger man with a handheld radio, began speaking in lower tones after stepping slightly away from Naomi, relaying details that were still incomplete but now officially logged into the system. The phrase "a possible identity mismatch" entered the report, not as confirmation, but as caution, and that single phrase began altering how every subsequent action would be interpreted. Naomi observed everything without interruption. She did not raise her voice, did not argue, did not attempt to assert dominance over the moment. Instead, she stood with a calm stillness. That contrasted sharply with the growing procedural urgency around her. Her presence, quiet and composed, created an unintended tension because it did not match the assumptions forming around her. Inside the station, a customer at the far end of the store slowed their movement, sensing the change in atmosphere without understanding its source. Outside, the hum of passing vehicles continued uninterrupted, indifferent to the unfolding administrative escalation inside. Officer Brooks requested confirmation from dispatch again, this time with increased insistence. His language shifted slightly, moving from suspicion to justification, as if reinforcing his original assumption through repetition. Naomi's identification had been scanned, but the system response had not yet fully returned. That delay, only a few minutes long, became the space where misunderstanding expanded. Naomi spoke again, her voice steady, asking whether standard verification protocol had been completed. The question was not confrontational, yet it introduced a structural challenge to the authority being exercised. Brooks interpreted it as resistance, though nothing in her tone suggested defiance. Instead of answering directly, he instructed her to remain silent while verification was pending. At that moment, the second officer's radio crackled with a new response. It was brief, coded, and noticeably different in tone from the earlier communication. There was a pause after it was received, the kind of pause that occurs when information does not match expectation. The officer glanced at Brooks, then at Naomi, and then at the screen on his device again. The system had begun returning classification indicators that did not align with the initial report. Naomi's identity was not simply valid, it was flagged under a protected federal category requiring elevated review. The implications of that classification were not immediately spoken aloud, but they altered posture, tone, and attention in real time. Brooks, still unaware of the full context, continued to operate under the original assumption, attempting to maintain control of the situation as procedural authority began to shift beneath him. Naomi, however, remained unchanged in demeanor. Her calm was not ignorance, it was awareness without reaction. And as the second officer stepped back to initiate a higher-level contact request, the environment inside the gas station subtly transitioned from local enforcement procedure into something far more sensitive, where every second of delay carried consequences neither officer had fully recognized yet. The moment the second officer stepped away to initiate the higher-level contact request, the atmosphere inside the gas station shifted from procedural confusion into structured urgency. Naomi Carter remained still near the counter, her hands relaxed at her sides, her expression unchanged, but the environment around her was no longer operating on local assumptions. Officer Daniel Brooks, still focused on maintaining authority, attempted to reassert control by rechecking her identification details through the standard database, but the response on his device had already begun to lag behind the escalation happening elsewhere in the system. The delay was not technical failure, but classification shielding, a process that restricted immediate visibility of certain verified profiles until authorization levels matched. Brooks interpreted the delay as uncertainty, reinforcing his belief that the situation was still unresolved, while in reality, the system was transitioning the case into a completely different jurisdictional tier. Outside the station, the sound of an approaching vehicle with no emergency lights drew attention from a few passers-by, but nothing about its arrival suggested urgency to the public eye. Inside, however, the second officer returned with a more serious posture, his earlier skepticism replaced with measured caution, as he informed Brooks that the identity response required immediate escalation beyond local command. The phrase he used was careful and indirect, referring to secured federal confirmation protocols, which changed the tone in the room without providing full explanation. Naomi did not move, but her gaze briefly shifted toward the entrance as if acknowledging timing rather than reacting to it. Within moments, 2 unmarked vehicles arrived outside, stopping with precision rather than speed, and the individuals who exited were not dressed as standard patrol officers. Their presence altered the internal hierarchy of the situation instantly, as they bypassed the usual entry procedures and made direct contact with the officers inside. One of them identified themselves only through credentials shown briefly and not spoken aloud, and the reaction from Brooks was immediate confusion transitioning into restraint. The new arrivals requested a full stop on all local processing until verification was complete, and the tone of that instruction left no room for interpretation. Naomi was not approached as a suspect anymore, but as a protected identity requiring confirmation of circumstances rather than accusation. The shift was subtle in motion but absolute in structure. Conversations that had been loud moments earlier dropped into controlled silence as each officer adjusted their understanding of what they were witnessing. Naomi finally spoke again, not to defend herself, but to clarify a procedural concern about how quickly assumptions had been made without full verification, her voice calm and precise, reflecting not frustration but awareness. The senior official who had arrived nodded once, acknowledging the statement without argument, and immediately requested a full audit of the initial report that triggered the stop. Officer Brooks stood slightly back now, his earlier certainty replaced by uncertainty he was not yet ready to articulate. The gas station, once ordinary and unremarkable, had become the center of a rapidly unfolding federal-level review, and every person present understood, even without full details being spoken, that the situation had moved far beyond its original misunderstanding and into a space where authority itself was being quietly redefined in real time. The arrival of federal-level confirmation personnel changed not only the atmosphere inside the gas station but also the internal behavior of every individual present, as if an invisible layer of protocol had been placed over the scene. Naomi Carter remained composed, standing in the same position near the counter, her posture steady and unaffected by the growing number of people who now filled the space with controlled movement and quiet coordination. The two federal representatives who had arrived earlier began coordinating directly with the officers on site, requesting immediate access to the initial incident report, body camera activation logs, and the timeline of decision-making that led to the stop. Their tone was professional but firm, signaling that this was no longer a routine review but a structured examination of procedural accuracy. Officer Daniel Brooks complied, though his movements reflected a shift from authority to observation, as he now found himself responding to instructions rather than issuing them. One of the federal officials briefly reviewed Naomi's identification again, this time cross-referencing it through a secure channel that required manual authorization rather than automated lookup. The response that followed was immediate and definitive, causing a visible pause in the room that did not need explanation to be understood. Without raising their voice, the official instructed that all enforcement activity involving Naomi Carter be suspended pending full administrative clarification. This statement did not accuse anyone, nor did it assign blame, but it fundamentally altered the direction of the situation. The officers present began adjusting their position subtly, no longer focused on enforcement but on compliance with the new procedural framework. Naomi finally took a small step forward, not in defiance but in clarification, asking that the sequence of events be recorded accurately, emphasizing the importance of consistency between observation and documentation. Her request was simple, but it carried weight because it aligned with the exact standards the federal team was now enforcing. Outside the gas station, additional vehicles had begun to position themselves in a controlled perimeter, not blocking access but establishing observational oversight, reinforcing that the matter had escalated beyond a local misunderstanding. Inside, the tension that had previously been emotional or reactive had now transformed into structured accountability. Officer Brooks, now visibly more reserved, reviewed his earlier assumptions in silence, recognizing that the initial interpretation of events had been formed without complete information. The federal team began reconstructing the timeline step by step, requesting clarification on the reason for the initial suspicion, the verification methods used, and the point at which escalation should have occurred but did not. Naomi remained calm throughout, her presence steady, not demanding attention but naturally drawing it through the clarity of her responses. The gas station, once a place of routine stop and ordinary transactions, had become a controlled environment of procedural correction, where every statement, action, and assumption was now being examined under formal oversight, and the weight of that shift settled quietly across everyone present without the need for raised voices or visible confrontation. The federal review process inside the gas station continued with a level of precision that shifted the entire environment from reactive confusion into structured verification, as every individual present adjusted to the new expectation that facts, not assumptions, would define what happened. Naomi Carter remained in the same position near the counter, her expression calm and composed, while the federal representatives expanded their review to include communications records between the responding officers and dispatch. The objective was no longer limited to understanding the stop itself but extending into how the initial information was interpreted and transmitted across the chain of command. Officer Daniel Brooks stood slightly apart from the others now, no longer actively directing the situation, but observing as his earlier decisions were reconstructed through documented timestamps and recorded radio traffic. One of the federal officials requested confirmation of Naomi Carter's full professional designation through secured judicial verification systems, which required multiple layers of authorization before returning a final response. During the waiting period, the room remained quiet except for the subtle sound of device notifications and controlled radio updates from outside personnel maintaining perimeter awareness. When the verification finally completed, the response prompted a noticeable pause among the federal team, not due to surprise in a dramatic sense, but due to the formal weight of what had been confirmed. Naomi Carter was officially recognized within the federal judiciary system at a level that required immediate procedural respect under jurisdictional protocol. The tone of the lead federal representative shifted slightly, becoming even more precise as they instructed that all further interaction must adhere strictly to judicial conduct guidelines. There was no accusation directed at any officer, but the framework of the situation had now changed from an ordinary field encounter to an incident requiring institutional review standards. Naomi acknowledged the confirmation without reaction that could be interpreted as emotional escalation, simply stating that her expectation was not interruption but accuracy, and that accuracy depended on consistent application of procedure regardless of identity. This statement further reinforced the direction the federal team was already taking, as they began documenting not only the actions taken but also the decision points that influenced those actions. Officer Brooks, still visibly reflective, was asked to provide a detailed account of the initial observation that led to suspicion, including environmental factors, timing, and any external inputs that contributed to the stop. His response was measured, but it became clear that some elements of the decision were based on incomplete verification rather than confirmed data. The federal representative noted this without judgment, simply recording it as part of the procedural reconstruction. Outside the gas station, the presence of additional support units remained stable, reinforcing oversight rather than intervention. Inside, the atmosphere had fully transitioned into one of institutional clarity, where every word spoken carried the weight of official record. Naomi remained composed throughout, her role in the situation no longer defined by how she was initially perceived, but by the verified authority that now framed every aspect of the ongoing review. The gas station lights reflected off the glass surfaces as the scene settled into a controlled stillness, where understanding was no longer shaped by assumption but by confirmed fact, and where every participant recognized that the outcome would depend entirely on the accuracy of what was being recorded in real time. The procedural review inside the gas station reached a more advanced stage as federal oversight expanded from verification into full situational reconstruction, with each piece of evidence being aligned into a single coherent timeline that reflected not only what happened, but how each decision point unfolded in real time. Naomi Carter remained present throughout the process, maintaining a steady posture that reflected calm authority rather than resistance or confrontation, while the federal team continued integrating dispatch logs, body camera timestamps, and communication records into a unified sequence. The environment outside the immediate counter area remained controlled, with the earlier tension replaced by a structured stillness that allowed documentation to proceed without interruption. Officer Daniel Brooks, now fully cooperative within the procedural framework, provided additional clarification regarding the moment initial suspicion formed, including the exact visual conditions at the gas station, the timing of his observation relative to arriving vehicles, and the absence of confirmed identification at the moment the decision was made. Each detail was recorded without interruption, and the federal representative leading the review ensured that all statements were matched against available system logs for consistency. During this phase, a secondary verification stream confirmed the earlier judicial identification, reinforcing that Naomi Carter's credentials were not only valid but active within an operational federal capacity that required elevated procedural respect under formal guidelines. This confirmation altered the tone of the entire environment further, not through emotional reaction, but through procedural recalibration, as every participant adjusted their conduct to align with the verified status. The federal representative then outlined the importance of distinguishing between observation and confirmation, emphasizing that procedural integrity depends on verified data rather than inferred interpretation, a principle now being applied retroactively to the initial incident. Officer Brooks acknowledged this distinction, noting that his decision-making process had relied on incomplete information at the critical moment of engagement, which was now clearly documented within the reconstructed timeline. Naomi Carter, still composed and steady, finally spoke in a calm and measured tone, emphasizing that her concern was never about disagreement with procedure itself, but about ensuring that procedure is applied consistently without deviation based on assumption. Her statement was recorded as part of the official record and integrated into the ongoing review. Outside the gas station, the perimeter remained stable, with no escalation or disruption, reflecting that the situation had fully transitioned into administrative oversight rather than active enforcement. Inside, the federal team concluded the immediate verification phase and began transitioning toward formal reporting, indicating that findings would be submitted through structured channels for further institutional evaluation. The lighting in the gas station remained unchanged, casting steady illumination across the counter and tiled floor, while the final phase of documentation focused on ensuring that every recorded detail aligned with federal standards for accuracy and accountability. The situation had fully shifted into resolution through process, where clarity replaced uncertainty, and where the final outcome would be determined not by perception, but by the complete and verified record now being assembled. The moment the situation at the gas station seemed to reach a breaking point, everything changed in a way nobody standing there expected. The woman remained composed, her voice steady and controlled as she repeated her request for clarity and due process, while the surrounding tension grew heavier with every passing second. The officers on scene exchanged uncertain glances, their confidence beginning to shift into hesitation as more questions than answers started to surface. A few witnesses had already begun recording, their phones capturing not just the confrontation but the growing sense that something about this situation did not align with what it first appeared to be. The woman did not raise her voice, did not resist, and did not escalate the moment, instead maintaining a calm presence that contrasted sharply with the confusion around her. Inside the gas station, the clerk stood frozen behind the counter, watching as the atmosphere transformed from routine confusion into something far more serious. Then, within minutes that felt unusually fast for an ordinary incident, the tone of everything shifted again when communication devices began to alert the officers. One of them stepped slightly aside to take a call, his posture changing immediately as he listened. The words being delivered through that line carried a weight that was not visible but deeply felt, causing a visible pause among those in authority at the scene. Conversations became shorter, more controlled, and far more careful. The woman, still standing where she had been directed, observed the change without reacting emotionally, her expression remaining focused and composed. Within a very short time, additional coordination began unfolding quietly in the background, not with chaos but with structured urgency. Information was being verified at a level that went beyond the local scope of the incident, and as those confirmations reached the officers on site, the dynamic continued to shift. The assumption that had defined the moment only minutes earlier began to dissolve, replaced by a growing awareness that the individual involved was not someone who fit the initial narrative that had been formed. The response that followed was not loud or dramatic, but instead marked by a careful recalibration of procedure. Instructions were clarified, steps were reviewed, and the situation was transitioned into a more formal and cautious process. The woman's identity, once misunderstood, was now being recognized in full context, and that recognition carried immediate consequences for how the encounter had to proceed. What had started as a routine misunderstanding at a gas station had now drawn attention far beyond the local level, prompting a structured response that reflected the seriousness of the new information. Throughout it all, the woman remained steady, her posture unchanged, her presence calm, as the environment around her shifted from uncertainty to controlled order. The tension that once defined the scene was gradually replaced by silence and careful professionalism, as every person involved adjusted to the reality that had just been confirmed, marking a turning point in the situation that no one present would interpret the same way again. The moment the quiet suburban gas station lights flickered against the late evening sky, no one present could have predicted how quickly an ordinary stop would turn into a chain of events that would ripple far beyond that single location. A woman stood near the entrance holding her phone and a small receipt, calmly explaining that she had just paid inside and was waiting for a ride share, when a patrol car pulled in and an officer stepped out with a cautious but firm posture, his attention immediately locking onto her as if something about the situation required closer scrutiny. What began as a routine interaction escalated through a series of misunderstandings, each one building on the last, as questions were asked, answers were given, and assumptions quietly filled the gaps in between. The woman remained composed, her voice steady and respectful as she attempted to clarify her identity and purpose at the location, but the atmosphere grew increasingly tense as more officers arrived and the space around her became smaller, filled with procedural instructions and formal language that left little room for personal explanation. Throughout the exchange, she repeatedly requested that verification steps be followed, offering calm assurances that her identification was accessible and that a simple check would resolve everything. Yet the situation continued unfolding under the weight of urgency and protocol rather than clarity. Minutes passed that felt longer than they were, until a critical point of communication was reached, one that shifted the direction of everything that had taken place up to that moment. The higher level of confirmation was requested, and within a remarkably short window, messages began circulating beyond the local unit, reaching administrative channels that carried far greater authority. The response that came back did not arrive with noise or spectacle, but with a quiet precision that immediately changed the tone on the ground, as if an invisible thread had been pulled from a much larger system. The woman's identity, once treated as uncertain, was now being recognized in full context, revealing that she was not only a private individual but someone with a position of federal judicial authority, and that her presence at the gas station had been entirely lawful and routine. The realization settled heavily among those present, not in dramatic confrontation, but in the stillness that follows when information realigns perception. Shortly afterward, a rapid confirmation from federal channels reinforced the correction, and instructions were issued to de-escalate and document the encounter with full procedural review. What made the moment even more striking was the additional layer of information that emerged, indicating her connection to a high-ranking military household, adding further complexity to how quickly assumptions had been made in contrast to the facts. As the situation resolved, there was no celebration or confrontation, only a quiet acknowledgement of error and the restoration of clarity where confusion had briefly taken hold. The woman, maintaining her composed demeanor throughout, simply continued her evening without raising her voice or seeking attention, leaving behind a scene that would later be reviewed not for drama, but for understanding how easily context can be overlooked when urgency overtakes verification, and how quickly a routine moment can transform when truth finally arrives in full